Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to thank you for joining us today and to extend a very warm welcome to everyone from wherever you're joining us from, to have this conversation on the global impact of US regression on access to abortion. Today, we have a distinguished group of speakers who will be sharing with us thoughts on how the current threat to abortion access in the US is affecting the lives of those needing access to care, particularly marginalized groups, and also what the global impact could be if the protections provided under Roe versus Wade are dismantled or undermined. We'll be opening today with some remarks from the President and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights, Nancy Northup, and then proceed to hear from a distinguished panel, and with a time for question and answers at the end. Before we start, I'd like to make a couple of administrative announcements. Please note that we are providing both French and Spanish interpretations for the session. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a globe icon that you may click and choose which language you would like to listen in. In addition, you may also enable live closed captioning by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to our first speaker, Nancy Northup, to give us her opening remarks. Nancy is the President and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights, and her leadership, the center has played a key role in securing legal victories in the US and around the world to protect and advance reproductive rights. Nancy was previously the founding director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York School of Law, where she litigated voting rights, campaign finance reform, and ballot access cases. From 1989 to 1996, Nancy served as a prosecutor and the Deputy Chief of Appeals in the US Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Prior to that, Nancy was a law clerk on the US Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans, and she has held adjunct appointments at the New York Law School and Columbia Law School, and taught courses in constitutional and human rights law. Nancy is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Nancy, welcome, and give us your remarks.
Great, thank you, Enid, and greetings to all of you. And I am so pleased to be on this incredible panel today. So thank you for being here and joining us. As Enid said, the Center for Reproductive Rights uses the power of law to make sure that reproductive rights are guaranteed in law as fundamental rights around the world. And we're the only global advocacy organization that specifically legally focuses on reproductive rights, with expertise in both US constitutional law as well as international human rights law. And we operate through strategic litigation, legal policy, and advocacy. And we've employed these to transform how reproductive rights are understood by courts and human rights bodies and governments. Our work has strengthened reproductive health laws and decision-making around reproductive rights and expanded access to reproductive health care in more than 60 countries. We work in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Asia, in the US, and we have robust work at the UN. Today, I'm going to focus on our work in the United States, defending abortion access in the wake of an unprecedented onslaught of legal challenges across the country. So, access to abortion in America has been guaranteed as a right under the US Constitution since the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade in 1973, so almost 50 years. And today in the United States, 1 in 4 women make the decision in their lifetime to have an abortion. But opponents of abortion have fought to restrict access really going back to 1973. And at the state level, just to kind of see where we are today, anti-abortion state laws were enacted in scores of places across the country last year. Almost 90% of counties in the United States don't have a single abortion provider. And in 27 cities, they have become abortion deserts, which is that people who live there must travel 100 miles or more to reach an abortion provider. Yet now the Supreme Court is being asked by the state of Mississippi to overturn Roe versus Wade and take that right away. The vast majority of Americans, polls say about 70%, don't want to see that happen. They don't want to see Roe reversed. But that may well happen when the court decides the Mississippi case, which the Center for Reproductive Rights is litigating, because the Trump administration in the last 4 years, previous 4 years, actively supported the anti-abortion rights movement. And it's important to note that the administration not only questioned abortion rights, but it questioned the very legitimacy of human rights generally, not to mention its application to reproductive rights in particular. And as fate would have it, and some pretty nasty politics, President Trump had the opportunity to appoint 3 new justices to the Supreme Court of the United States, which only has 9 justices. With President Biden now in office, the policy of the US government on reproductive rights has changed 180 degrees. The president established the first ever White House Gender Policy Council. And it's an all-government effort by the Biden administration to promote gender equity and equality in the United States domestic policy and in its foreign relations. And through that, the Biden administration adopted the first ever gender equity strategy for the US government, and again, covering both the domestic policy and the foreign policy of the United States. The US has clearly positioned itself in support of sexual and reproductive rights at the United Nations. And so this has been an enormous sigh of relief for those of us who work on these issues in the United States. But in the domestic context right now, abortion access as currently protected as a constitutional right will be up to the Supreme Court. So let me talk about 2 cases that we're litigating. We're litigating about 36 cases on abortion access in the United States, but I want to talk about 2 of them, which put a fine point on the difficult situation we're in right now. One from Texas and one that I've already mentioned from the state of Mississippi. So Texas passed a law that we have been challenging that bans abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. And that, of course, is before most people even know that they are pregnant. But what they did is not make it a criminal law or even a civil ban that the government would enforce. They set up a very pernicious scheme in which they authorized any person to be able to sue a provider, anyone who works at a clinic, anybody who aids and abets a person from getting an abortion after 6 weeks. Anybody can bring this civil lawsuit. And it guarantees a bounty of at least $10,000 for that person who sues to be collected against the provider, the clinic staff worker, the Uber car driver who drives someone, payable directly to the vigilante, as I will call the people bringing these lawsuits, and anyone who assists them. So again, you could be a friend who drives a friend to a clinic and be sued in the state of Texas and be made to pay at a minimum $10,000. This enforcement mechanism through private citizens has made the law very difficult to challenge. We and others in the reproductive rights movement did challenge the law. We've been up and down to the Supreme Court, but ultimately the Supreme Court refused to block the law. And we're now in state court trying to get some legal issues resolved. And meanwhile, since the 1st of September, people in the state of Texas have been unable to get abortions after 6 weeks and are having to leave the state if they have the means to do so. And many people do not. They cannot travel hundreds of miles to another state, perhaps have to stay overnight to get abortion services. The global community has been condemning this law across the US. I mean, we've heard condemnations across the US, but also from the global community. The UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls issued a statement calling what's happening in Texas a human rights violation. And the European Parliament approved an urgency resolution condemning Texas law as a violation of human rights. And we have welcomed these statements from the international community. The second I want to talk about is a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And at issue is a law that was passed in 2018 that banned abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And I should go back here and say that the Roe versus Wade decision, which also came from the state of Texas, struck down a Texas law at that time in 1973 that made it a crime to procure or attempt to procure an abortion unless you were trying to save a woman's life. And it said that abortion is guaranteed under the US Constitution in the 14th Amendment in what we call the personal liberty protections of the 14th Amendment. And they said that a woman has the right to make that decision prior to fetal viability, which is around 24 weeks of pregnancy. And in subsequent cases, there was some refinement of this document, which said, or this decision, which said that, yes, the state can have some restrictions or regulations in this pre-viability period, but they can't ultimately ban abortion. That's been very clear. So Mississippi's law banning abortion at 15 weeks is clearly in violation of the constitutional standard. I also want to mention that the Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is our client in this case, is the last abortion clinic in the state of Mississippi. And Mississippi passed this law to test Roe versus Wade. It was struck down by the trial court easily because it's such a violation. It was struck down by the conservative appeals court that oversees the state of Texas because it's so clearly a violation. And so it was shocking when the Supreme Court agreed to hear this case in May of 2021, because there was no reason under the framework in which the U.S. Supreme Court takes cases. They take them because maybe there's a difference in what lower courts have done around the country or some pressing need for clarity. There was no need for clarity. These pre-viability laws have been struck down over and over again by the lower courts. So it was a very, very troubling sign when the Supreme Court took this case and Mississippi asked for Roe versus Wade to be overturned. And I want to say that what's really been focused on in this case by the movement and in the public discussion is the fact that those who access abortion services and these kind of restrictions fall the most heavy on people without means, without living on low income, falls heavily on communities of color, and particularly Black women in the state of Mississippi, people living in rural areas, and young people. And in fact, the district court, the trial court in this case, was very clear about not just that this was an issue of gender discrimination to ban abortion, but also was an issue of racial justice. The trial court talked about this law being more like, in his words, the old Mississippi, which was bent on oppressing both women and Blacks in the state of Mississippi. And it also talked about the fact that there was a long history of such oppression in Mississippi, talked about the history of forced sterilization of Black women in the state of Mississippi, and talked about the fact that Mississippi, in fact, has not been focused on the health of women and children, but in fact, Mississippi ranks last in those health indicators. And so it's very important that the trial court understood this in looking at the law, not just as an issue of individual liberty, but as an issue of both gender and race discrimination. But nevertheless, the Mississippi sought review by the Supreme Court, It asked it to review the question about whether all pre-viability bans are unconstitutional, and the court took the case. There's no way for the Supreme Court to rule in the favor of Mississippi without gutting or overturning this constitutional protection. And if Mississippi prevails, the court might outright overturn Roe versus Wade, or it might uphold the law with some kind of new, very weak standard. But the result will be the same, which is throughout the nation, states are going to move to enforce pre-viability bans and other bans and regulations on abortion. And the analysis that we have done is that if Roe falls, probably almost half the states in the United States will move swiftly to ban abortion. 12 states already have what are called trigger laws. And that is that they passed laws years ago that said if Roe is overturned, then abortion will be automatically banned in that state. We'll obviously be challenging that as a mechanism that the states cannot use to do that, but it shows how strong the opposition is in some states. And if Mississippi prevails, and this is something we have been clearly talking about, you can't just change the constitutional law about abortion with respect to personal liberties. That the Supreme Court has talked about abortion in the context of that there is a zone of personal liberty that the government can't enter. And in that zone are other important protections for our personal relationships. So the Supreme Court's decision on marriage equality for LGBTQ people is in the same line of decisions and would be damaged by a reversal of Roe versus Wade in this case. Also issues around access to contraception and other matters of how we form and live with our families. So we know that the United States policies have massive impacts around the world, including on access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. We know the long-lasting impacts that the imposition of the global gag rule has had during the Trump administration and the prior administrations of George Bush and George H.W. Bush. And we also know that the U.S. reversing constitutional protections on access to abortion, which is recognized as a human rights under international human rights law, would also have reverberations and negative impacts around the world. And as an organization that is working to protect abortion access, both in the US and currently in over 25 countries, we want to support and contribute to the transnational solidarity and support in the wake of the far-reaching impacts of Roe if it is dismantled or undermined. And we also want to learn and ally with reproductive rights and justice advocates around the world, such as those who are leading the green wave in Latin America, those fighting rollbacks on abortion access in Poland, and those in many other countries are working every day to ensure people have access to reproductive health care services that they need. So I welcome and look forward to this conversation. And Enid, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Nancy, for the elaborate presentation. Moving forward, I'm going to introduce our three panelists before inviting each of them to speak to us. I'll start the introduction with Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng. At its 44th session in July 2020, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed Dr. Tlaleng from South Africa as a special rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Dr. Mofokeng is a medical doctor with expertise advocating for universal health access, HIV care, youth-friendly services, and family planning. She is a member of the boards of Safe Abortion Action Fund and the Global Advisory Board for Sexual Health and Well-Being for Accountability International. Dr. Mofokeng has been a commissioner at the Commission for Gender Equality in South Africa and advisor to the Technical Committee for the National Adolescent Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Framework Strategy in South Africa. She has briefed the United States Senate staff on the impact of the global gag rule globally. Dr. Mofokeng recently led the submission of the International Human Rights Amicus Brief signed by 7 UN human rights experts for the Dobbs versus Jackson women's health case at the Supreme Court. Nancy alluded to those cases in her remarks. I'd also secondly like to introduce Professor Michelle Brashta Goodwin. Professor Michelle Goodwin is a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, and a founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She is the recipient of the 2020-2021 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, the highest honor bestowed by the University of California. Professor Goodwin is an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the Hastings Center. Professor Michelle has co-authored and joined amicus briefs to the United States Supreme Court in support of cases argued by the Center for Reproductive Rights. Most recently, she joined the American Society for Legal History in its amicus brief on the history of political polarization and abortion rights in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. She also led an amicus brief of tort law scholars in June Medical Services versus Russo. Last year, Professor Goodwin testified before the US Congress to emphasize the urgent need to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, federal legislation that would protect the right to access abortion free from medically unnecessary restrictions and bans on abortion. Last but not least, I will introduce Giselle Carino, who is the founding CEO of Force Feminista, a progressive and growing feminist alliance of local partner organizations that share a commitment to ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health care, eliminating violence against women, girls, and gender diverse people, providing sex education, and advancing gender and reproductive justice by dismantling structural sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression. Giselle is a political activist, a political scientist and activist from Argentina. For more than 20 years, she has sought to mobilize change for reproductive justice across the global South by building connections, amplifying voices, and establishing new ways to more effectively meet the complex intersecting needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people. I'll now turn to Dr. Mofokeng for her remarks, after which we'll have Professor Michelle and then Giselle. So Dr. Traleng, please, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to join all of you for this important discussion. And I wear many hats today. Of course, I am the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health and led that what I think is very important amicus brief to the Supreme Court. But I'm also a person who may still require an abortion in the future. I am a medical doctor who is an abortion provider for the last 20 years. And I'm also a Catholic. And I say that tongue in cheek because a few months ago, I was disinvited by a university in the United States to talk about human rights and COVID when they found out, I suppose they read somewhere online that I am an abortion provider. And they were more worried about their funding, which comes from Catholic institutions, than they were about discussing the very important issues of human rights. I've also been someone before being appointed to the UN Special Rapporteur role, who's being a fierce advocate for women's rights in South Africa. And I often talk about, my advocacy work as a fight and a defense for autonomy primarily, because that comes across and it manifests itself in so many different ways in all of our lives. And so first and foremost, I am a defender of human rights. I am a defender of autonomy. And being a healthcare provider, I know firsthand how we can create an enabling environment as providers within particular facilities, but also to also destigmatize abortion in society, and also influence, policy change and legal reform. And I know also the power that we have to be able to offer dignified, equitable services and care, despite what the legal reforms are, because primarily we have an oath to take to first do no harm, but secondly, to provide services that are of quality. And it's from that sort of experience that I will share my thoughts today. And I want to say, of course, and locate my intervention within the politics of the body. Whose body is this? Who has rights to make decisions about this body? And in the General Assembly report that I prepared last year in October and presented, I discussed about, the controlling of sexuality, and in particular women's sexuality has its origins in patriarchy. And we've seen how patriarchal oppression and what I often term patriarchal violence is not specific to any country or region, but it is universal. But we do know that a lot of what does happen in the United States, whether you're talking about civil, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about the economy, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And depending on how strong particular regions of the world are, for example, in South Africa, we have a particularly strong constitution. We have the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act that protects the right to have abortion care and abortion services. We know that a lot of courts and a lot of judges can reference and do reference a lot of what happens in the United States. So it's very important to also realize that indeed what does happen in the US can have catastrophic impact. I've briefed Senate on more than one occasion, talking directly about how the global gag rule, for example, impacted me as a healthcare worker and basically fractured the ability of us as healthcare professionals in rural settings in South Africa to have coordinated and integrated primary health care, because it said those who receive this money cannot offer information, cannot advocate, cannot refer, cannot provide services for abortion, which meant as an abortion provider, myself was stigmatized within the healthcare profession that I am working within. And so the defense, the fight for autonomy, the fight for abortion care is really something that culminates, around abortion, and people can't hide, their hypocrisy, especially when it comes to abortion, especially when it comes to wanting to control the bodies of women, girls, and gender diverse people. And we know that our bodies have long been a site of discrimination, violence, and oppression, where these human rights violations have continued to occur unabated. And when you have legal reforms that seek to directly stifle and starve and deny people's rights to autonomy, to make decisions for self-determination, but also go further to harass healthcare workers, to threaten them with punishment and fines and sometimes jail time, that contravenes so many principles of health. It contravenes so many principles that are needed for the right of everyone to the enjoyment to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And we know that many obstacles lie between an individual and the enjoyment of these rights. They are interrelated, they are entrenched, and also lie in the context of the underlying determinants of health. And this is why it's important to really demand a look at the history, but also be honest that many of us are still living with the impact of colonialism in the very many different ways. And I think it's important as we make the connections between fertility, family size, people are making broader socioeconomic development arguments. I mean, the climate change and the rhetoric there around population control is also very worrying. So we have to be, I think, decolonial in our approach and refuse to be drawn into instrumentalist terms of how our bodies can or cannot reproduce. and therefore that then being used, you know, as a test to say who is worthy of services or not. And we know, of course, in terms of the impact of these abortion bans, the laws that are very restrictive. In many parts of the world, the pandemic, you know, of course, brought very important health measures that were adopted under emergency protocols, but they were not always in conforming with human rights law. And some of the amendments of laws have been used opportunistically to implement draconian measures precisely related to our rights to sexual and reproductive health and the rights of LGBTIQ+ persons specifically. I think we also need to think about how these laws also, what do they mean for people with particular disabilities? I think when health workers are even scared to give information, that means that people who have particular visual or hearing disabilities, no one is going to resource those particular you know, health programming or health information in a way that they can access, because often it means, you know, having some spotlight, I suppose, on you as a healthcare worker, because you are trying to reach out to the community on the ground. It means that healthcare workers themselves are going to feel very threatened and unable to fulfill their role. And just in closing, I just want to remind us all that under the right to sexual and reproductive health, states have three primary obligations. And the first one is the obligation to respect. It requires that states refrain directly or indirectly interfering with individuals' exercise of this right, which is sexual and reproductive health rights. And this is very, very important. And then I think I would say to my colleagues in the US, how do you advocate, you know, for your country, member state, to recognize the right to health and ratify the, you know, different important protocols and principles that go with it, so that you can further advocate for this obligation and hold them accountable. I think that's what it's about. It's about how do we, all of us, hold member states accountable. The other obligation is to protect. And this is very key because it requires states to prevent third parties, even private sector entities, from imposing barriers to the enjoyment of the right to health. Very important in a context, especially in the US, well, where the health provision is in primarily the private sector. And what role does the state have? You know, and often colleagues will ask this, but this is an important one, is that the states actually are required to prevent private players from imposing barriers. And the third one is the obligation to fulfill, which is the most proactive of all three. It requires the state to adopt measures to ensure the full realization of sexual and reproductive health. This is very important because we know many states will say it's a progressive realization over time. But we have a moment now in the US where not only can they claim it's a progressive realization, but they are actively putting in measures, retrogressive measures that are going to actually impede people's you know, realization of their rights. And so we also have to look, of course, at public funding. We have to look at the ways in which foreign aid, aid that's given on behalf of the people of the United States, is then being used abroad. I think all of our advocacy, you know, has to amplify each other and work much closer, I think, across the different regions, and of course even within UN bodies. And that's why I'm so grateful for having been given this invitation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mofokeng, and for really highlighting the very close connections between what's happening in the US and what's happening global. But I also like the fact that you've spoken to what providers, doctors, pharmacists actually go through on a daily basis, because that is one of the points that sometimes is forgotten, that it's not just a clinic that we are closing. There are people giving services, there are people who are being intimidated and harassed every day, but also talking up to the point of autonomy and decision making, that we should not be politicizing such conversations. So thank you so much for that framing. And, you know, to take us further, I'm going to invite Professor Michelle Goodwin to make her remarks. Just remind participants, because I know some people joined a little late, please put your questions in the Q&A, and you can follow us through interpretations with the icon on the globe, and you can also follow the closed captioning, again using the link below below your screen. So welcome, Professor Michelle.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you all. Nancy, thank you for those opening remarks, and the Center for Reproductive Rights for inviting me. Dr. T, thank you so much for helping to expand the landscape in terms of how we think about these issues, including with spending real time understanding the human rights implications of what it is that we're seeing today. As you rooted your talk in questions about patriarchy and power, it's important to understand that those are not illusory, but real issues that are on the table today, because in the very states in the United States where we see the encroachments and dismantling of access to abortion, we also see the dismantling of rule of law, the dismantling of democracy. And I say that quite intentionally and connected to voting rights. And in fact, if we're not paying attention to democracy in conversation with abortion, then we're missing important threads of the conversation. And so these threads, they include histories of imperialism, colonialization, and also slavery, quite honestly, within the United States. Some of the states that have been at the lead of dismantling abortion rights are states that had notorious histories entangled with human chattel enslavement of Black people. And even though there's been some seeming resistance to actually being able to be clear-minded of that, it's important that we are. These manifestations, as we think about Texas or the state of Mississippi, quite specifically, as Nancy mentioned, she talked about the district court opinion, which was written by Judge Carlton Reeves. It's an opinion that is so worth your time and understanding, including the footnotes where he talked about the real Mississippi, the old Mississippi, that one could not take seriously at all. The claims that came from Mississippi, that its efforts were all about protecting the health and safety of women. He questioned how in the world could that possibly be in a state that had never deigned to show any kind of empathy, care, or concern for the concerns of Black women in that state. He mentioned quite specifically Fannie Lou Hamer and what she called the Mississippi appendectomy, which sadly resulted in the coercive compulsory sterilization of children as young as 11 and 12 years old, all seemingly because they were Black and because they were perceived as potentially sapping the resources of the state. That really helps to set the backdrop for the conversation that we're having today as we think about the United States, but more broadly, because we should not navel gaze in the United States, because what does happen in the United States can have tremendous impacts around the world. And in fact, the United States can have tremendous impacts around the world, whether it is intentionally engaging in a particular practice, here thinking of the Helms Amendment, or whether it happens to be just indirect involvement. It's important to take some step back and to think about history in this context. In Roe v. Wade, it was not a close decision. It was a 7-2 opinion. 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. Justice Blackmun himself was put on the court by Richard Nixon. I say that because if some people were to believe, well, this is just simply the way things always were, that would not be true. And in fact, Justice Blackmun canvassed back even further in history to articulate that abortion was not always a crime in the United States. And in fact, that's accurate. The Pilgrims performed abortion, but it's also important to know that when we think about reproductive health care, particularly that's affected the lives of women, historically, nearly 100% of that had been done by women in the United States until about the time of the Civil War. Now, we don't have time to discuss all of that, but it is worth noting the racial and socioeconomic implications of when abortion became a crime. But even more if we spend time just around Roe v. Wade. Let's think about this. In 1966, Dr. King received an award from Planned Parenthood. And I think it's worth noting that speech, and I would commend you all to read that speech, where he said that there was considerable alliance between civil rights and women's rights, and that it was important for women to be able to control their own reproductive destinies. He used the terminology of cruel and cruelty when people were forced into having families that they did not want or could not afford. He said it was cruel for a child to be brought into a world where its parents could not afford to take care of that child. I mention that because of the stature of Dr. King, one, as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but also as a person of the cloth, because I think that that's also been distanced from the conversation today. Not our conversation, but the more general conversation. But I'd also mention this too. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. And I think all of that in conversation is really important, such that we understand today what we're seeing in terms of the nefarious use of power and control to upend abortion right for people who can become pregnant is something that is incredibly unique for these times, and in fact is so incredibly harmful. And here I want to touch on one other historical note, because in so many instances, we kind of anchor how we think about the right to abortion around Roe or perhaps Griswold v. Connecticut, people will think about. But I think it's worth understanding that the Supreme Court in 1973 cast a line back even further, and that would be to Skinner v. Oklahoma. And I know that for some people who understand that case, they'd say that, well, that was a case that was not about abortion, but in fact was about the coercion and sterilization. But it's actually important because that's a case where the court talks about the importance of human rights as connected with one's own reproductive destiny. And I think it's important for us to remember, because it's not just Roe in 1973, but that the Supreme Court was looking back to the 1940s and using the language of human rights in connection with individuals being able to manifest their own reproductive destinies. And in that case, the court talked about legislation that basically imposed nefarious interventions against the basic civil rights of people. The court talked about the state using its power in these ways that could have far-reaching and devastating effects. The court talked about when the state is coercive in people's reproductive lives, that can be evil and that it can be reckless. And I think that it's important to lean back into this case in order to understand exactly what's at stake today. In that case, the court talked about being forever deprived of a basic liberty. And that's at issue today. So let me just close with this, as I know my time is running out. In the backdrop of anti-abortion laws restricting access to something that is fundamental in terms of being able to govern one's own body, it's also important that we understand the high rate of maternal mortality that is connected with clinics closing, individuals not being able to have access to information or to birth control. And understanding that in the United States, for Black women, we're talking about a maternal mortality rate that's 3.5 times that of their white counterparts. And then when we look at specific counties in the states where these laws are existing, we're talking about 10 times the rate of death, 14 times the rate of death, 17 times the rate of death. So as we understand just what's happening today, we must put it in the context of democracy, of rule of law, and basic fundamental rights, not just to have an abortion, but even matters of life or death as they relate to Black and brown women in some of these states. I really appreciate being with you today. My time has come to a close, so I look forward to engaging in Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin. And thank you so much again for really drawing the lines and the connections and the emphasis between the historical narratives and connections and past injustices and repression that we are seeing being replicated today, and the serious impact it has, particularly on people, on liberties, but more particularly for Black women and other marginalized communities. And just to bring it home further, I'm going to invite Giselle Carino to give us her remarks before we get into the question and answer session. So welcome,
Wonderful.
Giselle.
Thank you. I will speak in Spanish, so letting you all know so you switch if you need. Gracias por la invitación a estar aquí con ustedes. Es un verdadero privilegio. Gracias al centro por crear este espacio, por invitarnos a participar. De verdad es un privilegio escucharlas. Doctora Nancy, doctora Michelle, doctora T. No sé cómo sigo a estas mujeres tan elocuentes, verdaderamente. Voy a hacer mi mejor esfuerzo. Gracias también por la interpretación. No solamente ustedes van a liberarse de escuchar el acento de alguien que no aprendió inglés como primera lengua, pero más importantemente es un esfuerzo de inclusión que nosotros valoramos enormemente. Para que sepan, nos ha permitido invitar a las 140 organizaciones con quienes trabajamos en FOS. Entonces me encanta que hayamos podido crear este espacio. De verdad sé que es súper importante. Y hablo aquí desde la experiencia compartida con muchas activistas por la salud, los derechos y las justicias en América Latina y el Caribe en particular, y desde el sur global. Nosotros acompañamos con mucho pesar las noticias de los retrocesos y los riesgos a las protecciones constitucionales en los Estados Unidos, no solo con una preocupación enorme por el impacto global que esto tiene, ¿no? en todo el mundo, sino también con mucha solidaridad para las mujeres, las niñas, las personas negras más jóvenes viviendo en la pobreza, quienes sabemos que aquí y en todo el mundo son las más impactadas, y todas antes que yo han hablado con muchísima elocuencia sobre esto, ¿no? Y esta solidaridad viene de una experiencia concreta de conexión de nuestras opresiones, ¿no? El patriarcado, el colonialismo, el racismo, que no pueden existir solos en sí mismos, que existen en conjunto, articulándose. Entonces uno puede analizar esto, es posible como contar la historia de este momento en Estados Unidos, como el derecho, quizás la lucha entre los republicanos y los demócratas de más de qué sé yo, 50 años, ¿no? Pero creemos que esa mirada doméstica y de potencia de este país, aunque es verdadera y es un buen punto de partida, es incompleta. Me gusta pensar en el contagio, primero porque soy una sobreviviente de la Omicron, porque quizás el contagio ha determinado, ¿no? nuestra mirada, no solo en las pandemias, pero como hablamos anteriormente, en el avance antiderechos y antigéneros en Estados Unidos, que influencia el avance autoritario en el sur global y que también es retroalimentado por ¿no? En este escenario global de política antigénero, que como saben no solo ataca el derecho al aborto, el derecho al acceso a la anticoncepción, el derecho a la educación integral en sexualidad, el derecho a la identidad de género, con un lenguaje bastante sofisticado de derechos, de supuesta protección a las mujeres, que creemos que fue lo que llegó a este momento en donde es posible atacar ahora en los Estados Unidos Roe versus Wade, ¿no? Mientras el gobierno de Trump consolidaba una mayoría en la Suprema Corte antiderechos, donde el Brasil de Bolsonaro también se afirmaba en una política exterior antigénero, que llevó al exilio a muchísimos activistas, ¿no? Y cuando en Polonia avanzaba la ofensiva que estableció la prohibición casi total del aborto, ¿no? Nosotros creemos que aquí la solidaridad feminista es más que un valor para la transformación, desde lo local hacia lo global, ¿no? Es una manera nueva quizás de comprender que las transformaciones y las resistencias están interconectadas por un sistema de contagio permanente. Si por un lado nosotras, en esto que se llama la ideología de género como un quizás fanatismo, ¿no? de nuestro tiempo a escala global, nos afecta terriblemente, también es cierto que los crecientes movimientos feministas a favor, con diferentes composiciones, con el vigor, con la fuerza de las nuevas generaciones, como lo vemos en Argentina, como lo vemos en Chile, como lo vemos en la República Dominicana, ¿no? Tiene un impacto enorme también de contagio. Acá nuestra mirada es que solo con una sociedad civil fuerte, desde el feminismo, es que podemos generar una capacidad de preparación para responder y resistir los ataques que, a diferencia del pasado, son muchos más conectados globalmente en este momento. Quizás entonces por eso mi objetivo en esta conversa hoy es defender la importancia de las articulaciones con el sur global en este momento de la lucha por el derecho al aborto en los Estados Unidos. Y quizás recordar que en momentos de muchas dificultades, como el presente, ¿no? Con COVID-19, como dije, con el autoritarismo antigénero, las desigualdades crecientes, en América Latina hemos logrado victorias históricas en la lucha por el derecho al aborto. Por eso afirmo que el contagio feminista es posible, y no solo es posible, es nuestra misión, ¿no? Desde FOS nosotros entendemos, como Nancy mencionó al principio, que es un momento de estrechar alianzas, de pensar juntas, de fortalecer los caminos de la solidaridad. Por eso quiero compartir un par de cosas que nos aprendimos en América Latina y el Caribe a partir de dos afirmaciones. Nosotros sí sabemos cuánto la política interna de los Estados Unidos impacta el sur global, ¿no? Sabemos, sentimos en el cuerpo los efectos de la ley Mordaza, el Global Gag Rule. No creo que necesite probar a esta audiencia eso, solo les cuento que cuando empecé a trabajar con equipos de salud en aborto en el 2004, cuando ya había pasado varias iteraciones de la ley Mordaza, todavía uno podía leer en los contratos de los profesionales de la salud la prohibición de hablar del tema del aborto, independientemente del contexto legal del país, independientemente de los recursos. Quiero decir, este daño es un daño permanente que perdura mucho después que la política se elimina, ¿no? Pero entonces, eso es un punto importante. El segundo, a diferencia del pasado quizás, el contagio de las ideas que partía desde el norte hacia el sur, ahora vemos que hay un nuevo orden de conexión, que es multidimensional y multidireccional. Sale del sur, va para el sur, sale del sur, va para el norte, es en múltiples direcciones. Y esto importa porque aquí radica quizás la esperanza feminista de transformación, en la permanencia de movimientos feministas en todas partes del mundo y la interconectividad entre ellos. La pregunta, no quiero hablar más de la ley Mordaza. Nosotros, como saben, hemos hecho muchísimos esfuerzos para traer las voces de las organizaciones del sur, para influenciar en Washington, para que se escuchen directamente las voces de quienes están al final recibiendo el impacto, ¿no? Pero sí quiero decir que la pregunta que creo que permanece es cómo nosotros logramos resistir la ley Mordaza. ¿Cómo fue posible documentar, denunciar sus impactos, la naturalización del uso de los cuerpos y la vida de las mujeres, de las niñas del sur global, como un campo de batalla? Este es el trabajo incansable de la sociedad civil y los movimientos feministas. No hay resistencia posible, no hay avance, no hay cambio posible en la defensa global de la salud y de los derechos sin la resiliencia creativa de los movimientos feministas, que por lo tanto necesitan ser acompañados, apoyados, financiados, ¿no? Como saben, es un trabajo laborioso, permanente, sin una expresión inmediata, ¿no? En términos de métricas de éxito, sin cambios inmediatos de esos que los donantes tantos nos demandan. Las experiencias recientes de avances quizás en la legalización del aborto en Latinoamérica y el Caribe mostraron una sorpresa para muchos, pero son prueba de ellos, de años de construcción de un movimiento feminista fuerte. La marea verde contagió ciertamente a la región. En los últimos 2 años nosotros fuimos testigos de estos avances que se produjeron en un contexto totalmente adverso, entre partidos políticos que mayormente no acuerdan, en el contexto de la pandemia y de uno de los lockdowns, una de las restricciones más fuertes que uno pueda y más largas que uno puede imaginar en un país, y a finales del 2020 la Argentina aprobó la legalización del aborto hasta las 12 semanas. Un país católico, requete católico, fragilizado por las crisis económicas, y esto fue posible gracias a la capacidad expansiva de los movimientos, trabajando en articulación por casi 2 décadas, para no solamente hablar entre sí, pero hablar con los profesionales de la salud, con los grupos de fe progresistas, con los periodistas, con los comunicadores, no solo en la capital. Creo que aprendemos ahí muy claramente que hay que invertir en lo que yo llamo el sur profundo, ¿no? Y que efectivamente en lugares desde donde soy, Córdoba, Santiago del Estero, lugares que no aparecen en el mapa de los donantes, en el mapa de las organizaciones, donde hay que apoyar una infraestructura que se necesita, porque es la que no solo produce el cambio, es la que lo sostiene. Les cuento, esto es lo que venimos aprendiendo. Nos dio mucho gusto apoyar, sabemos, ¿no?, que luego del cambio en México en el 2021 en varios estados, y luego la Suprema Corte, orgánicamente estamos apoyando, por ejemplo, un diálogo entre activistas mexicanas y activistas de Texas. Creemos que esa es una estrategia de solidaridad transformadora en la frontera, y creemos que es un ejemplo de conectividad, ¿no? Haber descubierto el misoprostol, el acceso al aborto con medicamentos, que aumenta la seguridad, y esto ha cambiado también, ha modificado las estrategias de incidencia para el cambio. Finalmente, dar acá un reconocimiento y contarles que en el 2021 la Corte Constitucional de Colombia está considerando un caso. Me da muchísimo gusto reconocer acá a las hermanas colombianas que se imaginaron que era posible verdaderamente pensar que en las Américas, además de Canadá, nosotros en el sur también podíamos tener el aborto fuera del Código Penal. Imagínense una idea totalmente innovadora, ¿no? Nos ayudaron a pensar a soñar que eso era posible. Un grupo de activistas que se consolidó alrededor de un movimiento llamado Causa Justa. Y este es un camino legal, es una herramienta legal, y es una herramienta legal muy importante, pero la pregunta es cómo es que se logró progresar en este debate. Y quiero decir algo, no fue por la genialidad de las grandes mentes legales, que las tenemos y que las necesitamos. No fue por eso, sino fue por el trabajo de movimientos feministas colombianos que demostraron que, aunque haya menos restricciones legales, porque Colombia tiene desde el 2006 una ley que permite el aborto en algunas circunstancias, eso no se transformó en más acceso para las personas. Las colegas que forman parte del movimiento Causa Justa documentaron cada año desde el 2006 quiénes eran las personas que no acceden al aborto legal. Las rurales, las indígenas, las pobres, las jóvenes, las negras, documentaron, y eso fue lo que consolidó un movimiento para poner enfrente a la Corte Suprema ahora, que ojalá se concrete, pero que si no se concreta ya cambió la naturaleza del debate. Este es un punto de inflexión en el debate en América Latina y el Caribe con relación al aborto. Entonces, solo quiero terminar para terminar aquí, decir que todos estos avances una década atrás habrían sido impensables. Yo no podía imaginármelo, no tenía la capacidad de imaginarme que esto fue posible, y esto solo fue posible gracias a años de movilización feminista, al poder de contagio y de diálogo de los movimientos entre sí, de la interconectividad, y que creo que como organizaciones, como movimientos, como donantes internacionales con poder de definición de prioridades, de urgencias, tenemos que hacerlo en forma solidaria y resistiendo esas pretensiones de establecer un orden necesario en la transformación, como si los cambios políticos surgieran en procesos lineales o siguiendo modelos teóricos, evitando el excepcionalismo. Yo encuentro mucho en las discusiones cuando hablamos de los Estados Unidos, cuando hablamos en la idea del excepcionalismo. Cada país es excepcional, porque cada cambio responde a las dinámicas locales, a sus características históricas. Entonces, evitar esa linealidad en el cambio, apoyar movimientos que desde afuera pues, no nos hace mucho sentido, parece contradictorio, no siguen los parámetros lógicos en los que estamos acostumbrados a pensar, es la clave de esta transformación, ¿no? y propiciar todos los espacios como este. Nosotros desde FOS tenemos el compromiso de crear todos los espacios posibles, una convocatoria abierta a todos los que quieran, a dialogar, a crear plataformas de diálogo, porque solo las organizaciones y las activistas de cada país saben qué es lo que es útil. No hay modelos, hay ideas que uno conecta para crear su propia trayectoria como movimiento. Así que les agradezco muchísimo, muchísimas gracias por escucharme y me encantará seguir este diálogo.
Thank you, Giselle, for such a powerful, powerful presentation and for really reminding us the place of the movement and the place of civil society and the need to really mobilize. You called it multi-directional mobilizing, global south to global south, global north to global south, north to north. And you also made a very important point around how we are seeing the instrumentalization of laws and narratives around the anti-rights and anti-gender conversation, and how these are actually slowly permeating across the world, from the US down to from the US and to other countries as well. I will not attempt to summarize your great presentation here, but there are a lot of questions that are coming through in the chat and others that are being passed on through the question and answers chat. And I'm going to start off asking the questions. These questions are directed to all the panelists. So if there's one that is directed to a specific person, I will mention that. We have a question that has actually been directed to Nancy and Michelle. And one of the participants is asking, would the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in the US provide better protection for reproductive rights? Nancy or Michelle, one of you can take the question.
Nancy, do you want to start?
Well, I would love to get the professor's answer first.
All right. Well, the ERA has been ratified now in 38 states. And so the wait now is to make sure that it can be certified. And I think it says a lot that there has been such resistance to it, which shows the promise of it. If it were something that did not hold the promise of protecting and making sure that there were equal rights afforded to all people in the United States and women at the forefront of it, there wouldn't be resistance. And, it's worth noting that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that the strategy that she thought should have been used with regard to reproductive rights should have been one of equal protection. And, today I talked about Skinner v. Oklahoma, and much of that case came down to equal protection arguments. And I think that that is a lot to be said about the disenfranchisement, the fact that we don't have equality that's forged for all people in society, the fact that we could look across numerous matrices and see the ways in which women still have not attained an equal status to their male counterparts in the United States. And so I think the ERA stands enormous promise in terms of righting some of what we see in terms of the wrongs that have been imposed against women historically in the United States.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and would simply add that it would be incredibly strong to have an equal rights amendment and to have a recent amendment. I'm always struck when I'm reading decisions from around the world that so many countries have the opportunity to have had new constitutions. And so whether you're reading cases from South Africa, Colombia, and elsewhere, these are constitutions that people have recently come together and ratified. And when we sit through Supreme Court nominations, and we're about to have another one in the United States, the conservative movement has focused on something that they call originalism, which is that the Constitution of the United States should be read as its framers, or any amendments were what was the understanding at the time. So, the United States Constitution is an 18th century document. And obviously both, racial, gender, economic equality were not consistent at that time. And then the amendments that we've talked about that protect abortion rights right now, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, was adopted in the middle of the 19th century in the wake of the Civil War. at a time when, women didn't even have the right to vote, which didn't happen until 1920 in the United States. So to have a recent, and so I'm always sitting through those hearings thinking, we need something that the people have recently ratified to give the strength to say, this is how we understand the Constitution today. So I think, and then to be able to, interpret that amendment, with the conceptions that we have in the CEDAW, right, in the Women's Equality Treaty around the world, that understands that differences in reproductive capacities, people who have uteruses and don't, it's a totally different, circumstances in child creation, whether you are the person carrying to term or not. So I think it would be an exciting development, which is, again, to get back to what Michelle said, why there's so much battle over it, right now. Great question. Glad you asked it.
Thank you, Nancy and Michelle. I have a question directed at Professor Mofokeng. For many years now, self-managed medical abortion and feminist accompaniment networks have been key in expanding access to safe abortion in Global South, including in legally restrictive settings. In late 2021, learning from the experience during the pandemic, the FDA decided to permanently allow abortion pills to be delivered by mail. And how do you envision the role of medication and telehealth abortion in the struggle for abortion access in the US and maybe also in the global context?
Those are two important areas that I'm quite passionate about, ensuring that we can get more people to have access, and safely so. And the WHO is very clear in terms of a definition of a safe abortion, which does enable us to be able to take on self-managed care. I think in the US, the threat of criminal clauses, right, or penalties or jail time, that threat, I think will stifle the efforts of people to take on this risk. It's just far too risky. For us in South Africa, for example, which is a completely different country legislatively, but also socioeconomic, and in that kind of context, we have an enabling constitution and an act. However, because we are not paying attention to the structural deficiencies of the system, we've been late in implementing what we could have implemented already 10, 20 years ago, because we have an act, but we are unable to innovate because a lot of the funds that come to support work around women's health, SRHR, are donor-led, and they set the agenda and they set the priorities. So there isn't much where we can innovate and imagine and dream about this sector. And if you look at the commodities that we are still using, the kind of aspiration, the instruments we need, they are as basic as they can ever be. And they are great because they enable even nurse practitioners to provide abortions. But you will find that you have a clinic manager who's anti-choice, anti-abortion, anti-women, anti-autonomy, who will not buy the necessary sterilizing equipment. You will have a pharmacist who may be anti-choice, who will not order and procure in the public sector the necessary abortion pills. And when more than 80% of the populations still depends on public service and public care, we need to ensure that the stigma that's structural and now embedded in the public health sector is dealt with, because you can innovate all you like, but at the end of the day, it's still the people, the humans in the system, who determine what can actually be replicated quite fast. But I think those guidelines give us a good starting point, but there are difficulties. For example, data costs in sub-Saharan Africa and other developing contexts is one of the reasons why telehealth is not picking up as good as it is. People don't have gadgets. Women who are already underpaid, who already have no labor protections, who are already often married but single because they are the only ones contributing to the household, now have the added costs, right, of procuring gadgets and data. So the innovations are great, but we just have to think of how do we make them equitable? How do we ensure that these programs can get replicated and understand the local context on the ground. And that's why participation is so important of civil society. And that's one thing I always talk about. We need to protect civil society participation at all levels, including local, national, regional, and international, and definitely within the UN space as well, because they know firsthand some of these difficulties and why we can't translate all of these innovations and great technical documents into actual services. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mufokeng. I have a question for Giselle. Force Feminista is an alliance of over 140 organizations and groups worldwide working to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights and justice. How does Force Feminista see its potential to act in solidarity and support the struggle for abortion rights and access in the US? And what would the alliance need to be able to unleash such potential?
Gracias, Enid, por esta pregunta. Sí, nosotros fuimos creados con el propósito de precisamente servir como una plataforma para articular diálogo entre movimientos, entre el norte y el sur y el sur, y todas las posibles combinaciones, porque creemos que es absolutamente central. Puedo decirte que quizás hay dos temas que cuando hablamos con cualquiera de nuestras socias en cualquier parte del mundo, surgen como los temas de mayor necesidad e interés. El primero, en precisamente poder crear espacios para estos diálogos y estos intercambios, un llamado al trabajo transnacional. Nosotros venimos de la experiencia, como hablé, de la ley en Argentina. La ley en Argentina, cuando estábamos trabajando el proceso, Irlanda cambió su legislación, como saben, un país lejos, bien distinto, completamente distinto, pero con una experiencia que nos sirvió muchísimo en Argentina, porque Irlanda también es un país como Argentina, predominantemente católico. Su aproximación a la conversación pública utilizando o trayendo al frente las voces de los profesionales de la salud de distinto tipo, contando las experiencias de las mujeres. Fueron experiencias que fueron muy valiosas para nuestro proceso, y creemos firmemente, y todas las organizaciones con las que hablamos todo el tiempo presentan como uno de los temas que quisieran que podamos tener y crear mejores oportunidades, ¿no? Y el segundo tema, que creo que es central, es que la sociedad civil en general en nuestro campo, en el mundo entero, ha sido muy golpeada por el COVID, ha sido muy golpeada por las políticas antigénero, por el Global Gag Rule, por las dificultades. Hay una necesidad enorme de financiar a las organizaciones de manera core, de manera de financiamiento institucional, y no solamente financiamiento institucional, financiamiento que permita a las organizaciones pensarse en el mediano plazo. Está claro que nuestras luchas son luchas de muchos años, ¿no? Ahí cambia la ley, todo el mundo aplaude, contamos los donantes felices, hay un win, como les decimos, no sé qué. Resulta que el día siguiente estamos trabajando en la reglamentación, porque ese es otro espacio de disputa. La reglamentación, garantizando que las migrantes pueden acceder a los servicios, que no se crean barreras innecesarias. El día siguiente que pasa la reglamentación, nosotras estamos peleando, no sé si les pasa a ustedes en sus países, pero en Latinoamérica y el Caribe la siguiente disputa es el uso fiscal de los recursos públicos, porque hay un montón de leyes preciosas, re bien escritas, con reglamentaciones, y después no hay recursos. Entonces nosotros como sociedad civil tenemos que capacitarnos en hacer seguimiento al uso de los fondos, a la rendición de cuentas de nuestros políticos. En el proceso en Argentina no hubo un solo candidato a presidente que no tenga que explicar cuál era su posición sobre 4 o 5 temas claves, entre ellos el derecho al aborto legal y seguro. Quiero decir, ese proceso de rendición de cuentas también es un trabajo de la sociedad civil, del movimiento feminista, y esos son procesos de largo plazo, ¿no? Mientras que el financiamiento que encontramos es específico en temas, específico en tiempo. Entonces creo que las dos necesidades enormes que nosotros vemos como emergentes a lo largo y a lo ancho de las organizaciones con las que trabajamos es esa, de financiar en el mediano plazo para que las organizaciones puedan trabajar, desarrollarse, invertir, Bueno, y ciertamente la necesidad de articularse y crear puentes, mejores puentes de articulación y de diálogo entre sí.
Thank you, Giselle. I have a question which is directed to either Nancy or Michelle about the US. Now, how can advocacy with the US Congress respond to or mitigate the potential impacts of the Supreme Court overturning Roe?
Maybe
I'll start off.
Go ahead.
Okay. Nancy, do you want to start?
Well, I was just going to start by talking about, of course, what you testified about before the Congress, which is the Women's Health Protection Act. And I just want to note that this is a piece of legislation that was introduced during President Obama's administration, introduced by the Congress, because it was clear even then that the restrictions on access to abortion were harming access across the country. And again, particularly for communities of color, rural communities, people living on low incomes. And, you know, here we are, flash forward a decade after this law was first introduced, and now it's absolutely vital. So in the United States, you can protect rights through constitutional decisions by the Supreme Court, through legislation by the United States Congress, which applies to the entire country. And then, of course, each state, we're a federal system. Each state has its own constitution that may have protections, and then each state can pass legislation. But there are many states in the United States, we talked about 24 are likely to ban abortion. So they're unlikely to protect abortion through their state legislation. They might have constitutional protections in some of those states. But it's really critical that every person in the United States is able to get access, and the Women's Health Protection Act would do that. And Congress has the power to do that under what's called the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. And I mentioned that because in the event that Roe versus Wade is overturned, Congress also has power under the Equal Protection Clause. But if that is weakened, there's still the Commerce Clause. So it has passed the House of Representatives, and the Senate is now all eyes on it. President Biden has said that he will support it and sign it, and does support it and advocate for it. So it's a matter of getting it through the United States Senate, which is not a very representative body, which is why we're challenged there. So I'll just start with that. But Michelle, you recently testified about the Women's Health Protection Act.
I think that you did such a great job, Nancy, in articulating what the potential is with the Women's Health Protection Act. And let's be clear, what that does is it codifies Roe v. Wade. And we understand that Roe v. Wade is not the North Star. It's important. It doesn't go as far as we would like, but at least with setting a floor, that's exactly what the Women's Health Protection Act would do. And there's other legislation that would seek to repeal Helms, that would address the Hyde Amendment. Those are also equally important. Nancy mentioned the importance of thinking about what's happening at the state level. Of course, that's what the effort that's been taking place over the last decade or so, which has been to move to the state houses in order to dismantle abortion rights. At the same time, states that are interested in protecting reproductive health rights, justice, choice, all of that, can in fact do that kind of work either through amendments in their constitution or else through legislation. Between 2010 and 2013, we saw more anti-abortion, anti-contraceptive legislation taking place in state legislatures than we saw in the 30 years prior combined. So we know it does work in order to use the state as a vehicle of change, either for good or for that which dismantles rights. And so there should be attention to looking at what can happen at the state's level, and also in safeguarding those states that will turn to becoming sanctuary states, essentially, for people who are seeking to have abortion and other kinds of reproductive health services.
Thank you, Michelle and Nancy. I know we are coming up to time, and there's a question that has been posed, and it's actually addressed to all. So maybe I'd like to ask this question, and maybe ask each of you to speak to that question as you also give us your final thoughts on the topic today. And the question is, from your different perspectives, what is most needed now to protect and defend the sexual reproductive rights of marginalized groups and those most impacted by abortion restrictions in the US and globally. What is most needed now? And so I can start off with Dr. Atlaleng. If you can start us off.
Yes, and thank you. In closing, I just want to say, I think what is the most needed is for us to organize more locally and move away from working in silos. And that's why I preach this defending of the autonomy, because if they can come after abortion, they can come after everything else. And in some instances, contraception, transgender health, you know, so it really manifests itself in so many different ways. And we will not win unless we are inclusive and intentionally so, but also aware in terms of where power lies within us and how then we can use that to the betterment of our community. I think it's important for us to also realize that the people who are anti these rights are very well organized and highly funded. So to expect individual advocates, individual women, individual feminists to pull up all the might they can have as individuals against a well-funded machinery and institution is going to kill us all. We are just going to be exhausted and wonder why we don't achieve the results and blame ourselves as if it's individual failure. The issues we are dealing with are very much connected to the bigger issue of racial justice, economic justice, reproductive justice, climate justice. And so we really have to be intentional about how do we grow the movement across the region, cross-mobilize across thematic areas, and let's not stigmatize each other based on different you know, characteristics. And I think it's about placing those who are most on the margins in the center. And I'm influenced, as you can hear, by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, whose work currently is being banned from the schools in the US. This is not removed from all of this. It's part of the bigger fight. It's part of the bigger battle. And so let us fight the erasure. Let us also amplify the work that we all do that is very important. And ultimately, again, I will say this as someone who's an independent expert within the UN, we have to protect the space and the civil society participation within the UN bodies, because it's very, very important. And women and organizations on the ground, indigenous women, have agency. They know exactly what they need. They're navigating these issues every single day. We need to ask people what is best for them, what is the priority for them, so that we don't come implementing what we think communities need. They need to be on the table, making decisions. And if we must, we have to be agile enough to be able to change to what the context is on the ground. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mofokeng. Giselle, may I ask you to go next, answer the question and give us your final thoughts?
¿Qué más puedo decir? Estoy completamente de acuerdo. Agregaría dos cosas a lo que Dr. T dijo tan elocuentemente. Toda la política es primero política local. Nuestras inversiones como movimiento deben estar puestas ahí. Como dije anteriormente, los movimientos feministas tienen la capacidad, a las feministas las oportunidades no nos llegan, los movimientos crean las oportunidades. Pero para eso necesitan estar fortalecidos, necesitan existir en todos lados, necesitan tener capacidad de acción. Entonces la política es primero local y ahí es donde hay que invertir. Hay que invertir fuertemente en los lugares menos conocidos, los lugares que no figuran en nuestro mapa mental de posibilidades. Tenemos un ejemplo atrás de otro de que efectivamente ahí reside la infraestructura, la columna vertebral del cambio, que no es solo el pasaje de la ley, que como dije, es el seguimiento posterior y la resistencia permanente. Y solo quiero decir, porque sé que este es un momento muy difícil, un momento en donde uno pierde las esperanzas en el mundo, ¿no? Y quiero decir que cuando pensamos que no tenemos nada más, nos tenemos a nosotras mismas. Y esa fuerza es en la que nos tenemos que apoyar para seguir luchando. Deben saber las mujeres americanas que las mujeres del sur global estamos con ustedes y vamos a seguir apoyando esta lucha en todos lados y creando todos los espacios de diálogo y de solidaridad que sean necesarios, porque cuando no hay nada más, estamos nosotras. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Giselle. What a powerful message of solidarity. May I ask Professor Michelle?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. Let me say this. I want to make two clear points. The first is that this is a marathon and not a sprint. How we got here was also a marathon and not a sprint. And as Dr. T mentioned, a well-funded, well-oiled machinery that has brought us to the point of the dismantling of reproductive rights here. But I also see this as a time of opportunity as well. And that is an opportunity where we can think about self-managed abortions, where people can avoid the terrorism that is inflicted at abortion clinics. I think it's important that we name exactly what takes place every day across the United States in places where people are seeking to get reproductive health care and terminate pregnancies, the threats, the harassment, the shaming, the stigmatizing that people endure and that we've just simply looked past. This is an opportunity to rethink and reimagine and resituate what exactly should be our North Stars in this domain, and understanding that as we re-envision what reproductive rights could be, that we're taking into account that it's not enough that only middle income and high income people can afford access, but that the most economically vulnerable and marginalized in our society should be able to have the best access to care and the gold standard of care. And that's important as we reimagine what a future could be post-Roe.
Thank you, Professor Godwin. Again, really important points. And Nancy, you have the floor.
Great, and I endorse everything that our co-panelists have been saying. The importance of movement building and also localization and also transnational movement building, all of that. And I also endorse what Michelle just said about opportunity. I mean, one of the things that's happening in the United States is, of course, if you can't rely on the court, you need to mobilize. And that is happening right now. I think about the fact that the words that I've pinned to my computer screen and will carry with me always are the words of Justice Sonia Sotomayor in the last decision that came down, in which the Supreme Court again turned its back on Texas. And she said in her dissent, I will not stand by silently. I will not stand by silently. And I think what's happening in the United States is every person, and again, it's the vast majority of people in the United States support abortion rights, are realizing they can't stand by silently. So many people have been working for so long, on mobilization, on the work on the state level, on changing things, as we've talked about, to be much stronger than Roe. I think about the work that's gone on in the past decade by the movement to address the funding issues in the United States on what's called the Hyde Amendment. And they have been working and working and working and gotten to a place where there's now federal legislation that Michelle talked about. But I think what needs to happen is every single person, whatever their sphere of influence. I was at Shabbat service on Friday night, and women who'd never spoken about their abortions before were up talking during a religious service about it, some of them shaking, some of them crying, but they knew that they could not stand silently by. And so I think we're going to see this in all areas of people coming to the fore, because at the end of the day, you've got to have, I'm a lawyer, right? And lawyers are necessary, but certainly not sufficient. You need to have movements for enduring long-term change.
Thank you, Nancy. I just thank you, our distinguished panelists, for making the time to be there and for such inspiring conversations. I've been looking at the chat and there's such positive feedback. But more than that, to our participants, you also decided you will not stand by joining this conversation. So we really appreciate you for joining us, and we know you'll continue with us on this long journey. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the time. the fight continues. So onwards and see you at the next platform where we continue to push for reproductive justice. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.